Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about an essay by Eric Foner on the subject of the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists who, in America in 1927, were accused of the murder of a security guard, sentenced to death, and executed in that year. The essay in question, written for The Nation magazine, was called The Men and the Symbols on August the 20th, 1977. In it, he cites the public intellectual Edmund Wilson, who said in 1927 that the case revealed the whole anatomy of American life, with all its classes, professions, and points of view, and all their relations, and it raised almost every fundamental question of our political and social system. Sacco and Vanzetti and their execution, much like the execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, threw up powerful and important questions about what kind of country America was. I think perhaps it's hyperbole to compare it exactly to the Dreyfus case, which created a national constitutional crisis in France. But certainly it is one of those cases that will not die, rather like the imprisonment of, say, the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six in Great Britain, who were accused of an IRA mainland bombing campaign that they never did. A gross injustice that is impossible for the state to simply erase away. And in both cases, with Sacco and Vanzetti, and with the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six, it's important to reflect on who the people were who were in the firing line, who were accused of monstrous crimes. Italian immigrant anarchists and working class Irish people, all easy targets, given the kind of the climate of the times and the prevalent political discourses running through society at the time. So let's get to know Sacco and Vanzetti a little bit. Eric Foner writes, "In origin, Sacco and Vanzetti were no different from the millions of other immigrants who entered the United States in the early 20th century. Sacco was born in the village of Torremaggiore in southeastern Italy, one of 17 children in a relatively prosperous peasant family. Emigrating to this country, America, in 1908, at the age of 17, he learned to edge trim shoes and worked in a shoe factory in Milford, Massachusetts. The common picture of Sacco as a good shoemaker, suggesting the familiar Italian-American cobbler, is misleading. He was a skilled factory workman who commanded high wages. But by the time of his arrest in 1920, he was married, owned a house, and had accumulated $1,500 in savings. In contrast to Sacco, the settled family man, Vanzetti was an itinerant and skilled labourer, one of the innumerable tramps and migrants of the period who could not or would not adjust to the discipline of the new industrial order. Born in northwestern Italy in 1888, he spent 7 years in school and later took great pride in recalling his excellent record. Arriving in America in 1908, he was first a dishwasher in New York City restaurants, then roamed New England, working variously in a stone quarry, a brick furnace, digging ditches, and finally as a fish peddler. Neither man had come to America as a radical, but both were attracted to anarchism here. Sacco and his wife on occasion performed in street theatre to raise funds for the anarchists, and both men were involved in strikes and war resistance. Sacco collected bread for the Lawrence strikers in 1912 and assisted strikes of Massachusetts foundry and shoe workers. Vanzetti was blacklisted for his part in the strike at the Plymouth Cordage factory in 1916. When the two men met is not known. However, in 1917, Sacco, Vanzetti, and other New England anarchists fled to Mexico for a year to avoid the draft and possible deportation for anti-war activities. The more intellectual of the two, Vanzetti, during his years in America, read books ranging from Dante to Marx, Tolstoy, and Kropotkin. Both lived among Italians, neither spoke English, and and both planned to return to Italy. It was their arrest that made them fully part of American life. So, Here you have two men who existed in this immigrant community that wasn't very deeply penetrated by the English language or incorporation or what you might call assimilation into American life. Circulating amongst these immigrant communities was often but not exclusively, the radical politics that had come with them from Europe. When you look at accounts of Leon Trotsky coming to New York in 1917, he's greeted by mainly immigrant Russians who shared similar socialist ideas to him, and he disappears really into a kind of a very little known world of Russian revolutionary politics in New York. If you've ever seen the documentary Manufacturing Consent about Noam Chomsky, he talks about his early life and the vast range of anarchist literature and anarchist newspapers on sale in New York from newsstands in Polish, in Ukrainian, in Yiddish. So these cultures existed, and it's only really been with the kind of the application of a century of determined effort that they have been effectively stamped out or at least pushed sufficiently underground. However, if you look at the state of political radicalism in America today, you'd have to argue that these kinds of things are very much back with a vengeance. However, during the post-war Red Scare, immigration and anti-communism become inextricably interlinked in the minds of everyone from J. Edgar Hoover, Warren Harding, all the way down to the readers of national newspapers, the kind of growing suburban middle-class bourgeois Americans who felt under threat from this militancy. The reality, of course, being that there was very little direct threat to the standards of living of middle-class Americans from resentful and angry, striking working-class poor Americans and new immigrants. I'm purposefully leaving the story of black Americans out of the conversation here, not out of any desire to discriminate, but because the social and economic factors, their ability to form unions, their ability to strike, is deeply affected by racism in America, and it's a much bigger and longer conversation. And unionisation amongst black sharecroppers in the 1920s meets with an equivalent degree of extreme violence, but this is often extra-legal Ku Klux Klan type stuff, whereas the destruction of Sacco and Vanzetti and the white immigrant American left didn't need the intervention of the Ku Klux Klan. Organs of state like the FBI were on board with that one. So the facts of the crime are this. On April 15th, 1920, at a shoe company in South Braintree, Massachusetts, there's a robbery and a murder. A paymaster and a guard were carrying $16,000 of payroll to the factory, and two men who'd been waiting nearby shot and killed them. They were picked up by a car carrying three other men. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested 3 weeks later while accompanying a friend of theirs, Mike Boda, an anarchist, who was thought to have been involved in the crime, and they were taking him to pick his car up from a repair shop. When the trial happened, a major issue was made of the fact that Sacco and Vanzetti were armed at the time of their arrest, and also the fact that they lied under questioning. They said that they didn't know Boda, and they said that they weren't anarchists. The behaviour alleged by the prosecution suggested guilt. Fairly thin and flimsy level of proof demanded there, really. At the time, they had not been told of the charges against them, so under the conditions of the Red Scare, they may well have thought that they were being accused of some sort of political crime or misdemeanour. There were anarchists being deported from the country in 1920. They weren't aware that they were being accused of robbery, and they weren't aware that they were being accused of murder. So they may well have simply been attempting to deny that they were anarchists to prevent themselves from being deported. This, in turn, becomes an establishing feature of their supposed guilt at trial, which is, why we have systems of, hopefully in functioning democracies, systems of checks and balances where self-incrimination doesn't take place under interrogation. And it's worth discussing for a moment the Red Scare and the context behind the Sacco and Vanzetti case. So the Red Scare and the political repression that went with it were perhaps the most severe, before 9/11, the most severe and prolonged attack on American civil liberties and freedoms during the 20th century. That you have during the First World War, for example, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which make it illegal to speak out against the war. Virtually any kind of anti-war comment or sentiment could wind up with a jail sentence. However, the political importance of creating monstrous moral panics and fears didn't decline with the end of hostilities. So instead of the Germans, the Hun, as a threat to civilization, the foreign-born revolutionary replaces that figure. And the 1920s see a continuation of the same kind of press reporting and political repression. So, for example, the Red Scare, which began with the Palmer raids, mass arrests in 1920, where 4,000 radicals were arrested and several hundred were eventually deported. Ironically, many of these were social democrats and anarchists who were deported to the Soviet Union, where they were promptly arrested, and many wound up being executed by the Bolsheviks, who had no interest in rival figures on the left emerging from the United States. One contemporary of Sacco and Vanzetti's was the Italian anarchist Andrea Salcedo, who accidentally fell out of a window in a police building, falling 15 stories to his death after being questioned by federal agents. So you can understand why Sacco and Vanzetti may have been slightly nervous. The trial began on May the 31st, 1921, and the prosecutions tried to place Sacco and Vanzetti at the scene. And they tried to do that through eyewitnesses and some physical evidence. The defence produced eyewitnesses who denied either men had been there, and they produced solid alibis to show that the men hadn't been there either. The evidence that convicted Vanzetti was pretty weak. There was one man who claimed to have seen him at the scene of the crime, identifying Vanzetti as the driver of the getaway car, but this contradicted almost all other witnesses who described the driver having fair complexion. The prosecution alleged, with very little evidence, that a .38 revolver Vanzetti was carrying at the time of his arrest belonged to the murdered guard. The defence produced 13 witnesses, all Italian, to testify that Vanzetti had been selling fish on the day of the crime. Sacco, witnesses alleged, had both been at the scene of the crime and not been there. Some witnesses for the prosecution had viewed Sacco on his own instead of in a lineup, which was a violation of police procedures. The first thing that the witnesses did is that they confirmed to themselves, in a kind of classic case of confirmation bias, that he must therefore have been there. For example, once they had seen Sacco in the one-man lineup, they were their memories of what the killer looked like suddenly seemed to dramatically improve. And that tells you more about kind of the merging of imagination and memory that we all tend to suffer from than anything else. Both prosecution and defence produced ballistics experts to prove that the 32 bullet from the gun that killed the guard had been fired by Sacco. A prosecution expert has been carefully coached by the prosecution to say the exact wording that would make it almost incontrovertible that this had happened, whereas the reality is that later he recounted his testimony and said it was not possible that Sacco's gun could have fired the shot. In 1961, two independent experts reaffirmed that Sacco had fired the fatal shot, but this still remains in dispute. That day, supposedly, Sacco had gone to the Italian embassy in order to gain a visa to return back to Italy. There were witnesses there who could attest to this, but more significantly, there's evidence that the prosecution didn't show. There was no attempt to determine who had fired the other 5 bullets that were found at the scene. There was no attempt to find the stolen money or to link it to the defendants. Nobody knew what that had happened to that. There was no attempt to establish a motive for the crime, and there was no presentation of fingerprints as evidence. However, newspaper reports indicated that fingerprints had been found on the getaway car, which would surely suggest, if those hadn't been presented, that there's a significant reason why. The trial was conducted in an atmosphere of intense hostility to the defendants. Newspaper reporters were astounded by the prejudice shown by the judge, Webster Thayer, and the prosecutor, Frederick Katzman, who bullied the defendants really regarding their political beliefs. And the politics, the anarchism of the two men was also put on trial. Sacco was asked whether he loved America, whether he thought America was a free country, why he'd avoided the draft, and what he thought of Harvard University, and whether he had sent his son to public school, which he had done. He later said, Katzman, to a friend, "Did you see what I did with those anarchistic bastards?" So conviction was really a foregone conclusion, much as it was in Great Britain in the 1970s with the Guildford and Birmingham pub bombings. And I think that the story here is not so much the tragedy of the execution, really the judicial murder of Sacco and Vanzetti, but the political climates that create these miscarriages of justice and the weakness in democratic and judicial processes that result in policemen, prosecutors, and judges and juries really unconsciously collaborating with one another to produce not a judicial outcome but a political and an ideological one, i.e. these people are enemies of the state and they must be destroyed, not really the workings of a judicial system where justice is meant to be blind, irrespective of the beliefs of those who might be on trial. For the following 6 years, defence lawyers filed motions to call for a new trial. They claimed that there was new evidence, that some prosecution witnesses had recanted their testimony, that there was an organised crime gang, the Morelli Gang of Providence, Rhode Island, who had carried out the robbery that evidence suggested. Thayer rejected all motions, and the Supreme Court upheld the decision. In 1927, Thayer pronounced a sentence of death, and at this point the case had gone global. It had become an international cause célèbre, and it shone a light on the American judicial system. Massachusetts Governor Fuller said that he appointed a 3-man advisory committee that would consider the fairness of the verdict. President of MIT, Samuel Stratton, a former judge, Robert Grant, and at the head, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard University. And these were really powerful establishment figures who could legitimise the judicial process. And the New Republic reported at the time The life of an Italian anarchist was as foreign to them as life on Mars. Lowell's presence, writes Eric Foner, Lowell's presence recalled the turbulent history of the immigrant factory workers in the cities bearing his familial names. For years he'd been an official of the Immigration Restriction League. Among his contributions to life at Harvard was the establishment of a segregated residence for black students. The Commission's findings affirmed the verdict and sentence, and despite last-minute appeals to the federal courts, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. What more can immigrants from Italy expect, remarked Hayward Broun. It is not every prisoner who has a president of Harvard throw the switch for him. One point that Eric Foner makes, and I think this is very important, is that it's pretty low-hanging fruit, pretty obvious stuff, to say that this was a political trial. And yet many commentators, Eric Foner points out, don't take the politics of the two men seriously at all. It's as if to suggest that, well, they were probably innocent, but they spouted all this kind of naive, anarchic, utopian sort of stuff, which is to suggest that if one had a kind of more mainstream set of political ideas, if one was sort of centre-left and centre-right, then a miscarriage of justice against that individual might actually be somehow worse. Defence lawyers seem to have sabotaged Sacco and Vanzetti before the jury. Herbert Ehrman, one of the defenders, said he found their political views absurd and pathetically impracticable. Historian Roberta Feuerlicht, who has also reviewed the case, who believed in the men's innocence, spoke of them prattling about the proletariat. And the subtext to this is that anarchism was such a flawed idea that she could only be sceptical how deep their beliefs ran. And Foner points out that actually it was a central article of faith in the lives of both men. Anarchism hasn't really fared the 20th century, the storms of the 20th century, very well. It has been as devastated by the left as it has by the right. Soviet communism and Maoism and the various other state-led radical left projects of the 20th century devastated anarchists in their path. You only need to look at Stalinism in Spain to see that. So it's difficult for us to remember now seeing anarchism as a fringe discourse, though I think in Trump's America it seems to be making something of a comeback, that before the First World War and during the First World War, anarchism was the leftist creed of Europe. That people like the Bolsheviks were in a minority, and the thing that the game changer for Marxist-Leninists was the acquisition of the levers of state power in the Soviet Union. So when we look back at Sacco and Vanzetti, we need to try to kind of rethink what we think about anarchism at the time, as it not being a kind of a fringe crackpot ideology, but a mass movement. And it wasn't simply imported into America, it was homegrown. You rewind by 20 or 30 years and look at things like the Haymarket riots and all that. For this, read The World That Never Was by Alex Butterworth. But there was a deep and rich vein of American anarchism in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it didn't simply come on ships from Italy and Spain and Ireland and Poland and arrive at Ellis Island. Not at all. And there's a lot more to be said on the subject of American anarchism, and I hope to return to this pretty shortly. The Foner essay in Battles for Freedom, which you can get through my good buddies at IB Taurus, it goes on for quite a lot longer than I've got time to talk about now, but hopefully there'll be an opportunity in the next week or so to dip back into the roots of American anarchism and immigrant anarchism and explore it more thoroughly. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast.